Joining us now to discuss the continuing and mounting pressure in this conflict, Middle East expert Joshua Muravchik. He's the author of the new book, Making David into Goliath: How the World Turned Against Israel. He's also a fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Joshua, we welcome you into America's Forum. Thank you so much for spending some of your Friday with us.
Oh, thank you, JD. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
So, Joshua, where do you see this surge of violence going next? Will we see more escalation here?
Well, it's certainly going to go on for a while. There'll be, I think, more. I think there will be some escalation, more strikes from both sides. Whether or not Israel will turn to ground troops remains a big question. I think it's likely to happen, but of course the Israelis, even though the Prime Minister Netanyahu is supposed to be a hardliner, a tough guy, he's reluctant to do that because they'll take a lot of casualties, and also they will be blamed, as is happening already, because the dynamics of this situation seem to be the Palestinians or other Arabs attack and kill Israelis. Israel fights back to defend itself, and then most of the world blames Israel.
Given that dynamic, and now that we hear the White House wants to weigh in, volunteering to have the United States negotiate a truce, do you think that will be given any consideration by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli cabinet?
No, I don't think it'll be given any, and it shouldn't be given any. You know, there are actually, there is in place a better mediator than President Obama or the United States government, and that is the Egyptian government, which actually both sides trust more. And in fact, we do have stories that when this exchange of fire started up, 2 weeks ago, Israel was not looking for a fight. There had been relative quiet for a couple of years, and Israel apparently sent messages through the Egyptian, probably military or intelligence intermediaries, that they would be happy with both sides stopping firing, and Hamas turned that down. So I don't think the problem is that we need a mediator, and for Obama to become the mediator would simply amount to a backdoor way to give recognition to Hamas, which the United States has refused to do until this time. Obama may want to do that.
Josh, let me ask you a little bit about, since you brought up Egypt here, the previous ceasefire, if you will, whatever you want to call it, was negotiated with Morsi, who's now being detained in Egypt. There's a new president there, General al-Sisi. What do we know about him and his willingness to get involved in the middle of this, if you say Egypt is really the best option here?
Well, there's a big difference in that Morsi was a real supporter of Hamas, because Hamas is essentially just the Palestinian version of the Muslim Brotherhood, the same Islamist movement that Morsi's from. But bear in mind that it was not Morsi who negotiated before. It was there are people in the Egyptian military and intelligence, and this goes back well before the overthrow of Mubarak, who have maintained very strong lines of communication with Israel, and also had strong lines of communication with the Palestinians, including with Hamas.
So in other words, we're in better shape now. You think al-Sisi's the better guy to have in place in Egypt in terms of negotiating a peace between Israel and the Palestinians?
Oh, I think Morsi couldn't have done it at all, but I think even during Morsi's tenure, there were still the connections between the military officials in Israel and Egypt and the intelligence officials that were ongoing.
Well, Joshua, as you mentioned, Egypt being looked upon as the broker in this situation, regardless of who may be leading the nation of Israel, the leadership here at home, I think there are implications here. Has the trust between Israel and the United States eroded to the point that Israel, I don't want to say puts the United States on the back burner, but you said, hey, look, they wanted to use Egypt as the intermediary. How bad have things gotten between the Obama administration and the government of Israel?
Well, certainly the Israelis would have more trust in their usual contacts in Egypt, that's the military and intelligence people, than they would have in Obama. And Obama's actions on this whole conflict have been absurd. That is, last week earlier this week, he wrote an op-ed. This is a very strange way for a president of the United States to carry out policy. He wrote an op-ed in the leading leftist Israeli newspaper, calling on both sides to show reasonableness and restraint. Now, what does it mean that, first of all, it was an Israeli newspaper. He wasn't addressing this to the other side. But second of all, what does it mean for Hamas to show restraint? Meaning, instead of murdering 3 teenagers, they should have only murdered 2? Or instead of firing 1,000 rockets into Israel, as they've done the last few days, they should only fire 500? The concept is absurd.
Well, Josh, I wanted to also get your take on something that John McCain said previously, suggesting that John Kerry go over there and try to get involved in the middle of all this. You know, you can fault John Kerry for a lot of things, but one of those is not being in Israel enough. He's been there numerous times, and some might say his meddling in this situation may have made things worse. What was McCain saying? Was that naive to have, think that Kerry could go over there and do some good?
Yes, it was naive. Kerry, Kerry is kind of feckless character in the Middle East. If you recall, before he spent all this time on the Israel-Palestinian negotiations of the past 9 months, it didn't amount to anything, and all of the experts on all sides said in advance wouldn't amount to anything. Before that, when he was a leader in the Senate, he spent years going to Damascus again and again and again,
right.
Because he had this idea that he was great pals with Bashar al-Assad and that he could somehow turn Syria around into being a good guy, friendly country. I think Kerry is a guy who just doesn't get it. By the way, if you go back to the 1980s, he kept going to Nicaragua because he was great pals with the Sandinistas, and he thought he could talk to them and they would behave with restraint and reasonableness, to quote President Obama.
Well, whatever his notions of personal diplomacy may be, and I would agree with you, they're more than passing curious. I want to talk more about your book, Joshua, especially in terms of the UN and the rise of the so-called non-aligned movement. Has that basically put together this dynamic where Israel has been demonized and vilified internationally?
I think that's right, JD. The UN is a kind of capsule of everything that's happened to Israel over these past decades, which is the UN now, 2/3 of its members belong to the non-aligned movement, but that's about 120 countries, but almost half of them, 57, are also members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And at the core of that group are the 22 members of the Arab League.
And so we can see that dangerous synergy right there that changes public opinion in the world against Israel. Joshua Muravchik, the name of the book is Making David into Goliath, How the World Turned Against Israel. We thank you for your time. We'll visit with you again as events warrant, and there is more to come here on America's Forum. Please stay tuned.